Hi, welcome to the quiz. You can answer along on quizalto.com, all for free. The exact URL of this quiz will be in the notes down below. Let's get started. Good luck. What is a key consideration when selecting AWS fault injection service target resources for fault injection tests? To choose resources with the highest cost savings potential. To select resources with the lowest data transfer rates. To ensure resources are representative of production environments. To target all resources simultaneously for comprehensive testing. A key consideration when selecting AWS fault injection service target resources for fault injection tests is ensuring they are representative of production environments, providing realistic test scenarios. What is a limitation of AWS fault injection service? Requires root access to all EC2 instances. Cannot inject faults into on-premises resources. Does not support fault injection into Lambda functions. Limited to testing HTTP traffic only. AWS fault injection service is limited to injecting faults into AWS cloud resources and does not support on-premises systems or Lambda functions. Which AWS service can be used in conjunction with AWS fault injection service for monitoring and alerting during fault injection tests? AWS CloudWatch, AWS X-Ray, AWS Inspector, AWS Shield. AWS CloudWatch can be used alongside AWS Fault Injection Service to monitor resources and set up alerts during fault injection tests, helping track performance and resilience metrics. What is a key advantage of using AWS Fault Injection Service over traditional testing methods? It provides faster test results. It automatically rolls back changes post-testing. It requires less manual configuration. It enables testing in production-like environments without causing actual disruptions. AWS Fault Injection Service allows testing in production-like environments by injecting controlled faults without causing actual disruptions, which is advantageous over traditional methods. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate DNS resolution failures? Amazon Route 53. AWS Key Management Service, AWS Database Migration Service, AWS Secrets Manager. AWS Fault Injection Service can integrate with Amazon Route 53 to simulate DNS resolution failures and test application resilience to DNS-related issues. How can AWS Fault Injection Service help improve disaster recovery strategies? By enhancing DNS resolution. By automating daily backups. By identifying weaknesses in recovery procedures through controlled tests. By reducing data transfer times. AWS Fault Injection Service helps improve disaster recovery strategies by identifying weaknesses in recovery procedures through controlled fault injection tests. What is a recommended practice when scheduling AWS Fault Injection Service experiments? Run experiments during off-peak hours to minimize user impact. Use all available AWS regions simultaneously for fault injection. Conduct experiments without prior approval from stakeholders. Increase the fault injection rate gradually during experiments. A recommended practice when scheduling AWS Fault Injection Service experiments is to run them during off-peak hours to minimize potential user impact and disruptions. What is a primary use case for AWS Fault Injection Service in development environments? Testing and validating disaster recovery plans. Optimizing data transfer speeds. Improving database query performance. Simulating peak traffic conditions. A primary use case for AWS fault injection service in development environments is testing and validating disaster recovery plans through controlled fault injection. What is a limitation of AWS fault injection service in relation to fault injection into EC2 instances? It requires manual intervention to restart instances after fault injection. It does not support fault injection into instances with attached EBS volumes. It cannot inject faults into instances using specific instance types. It can only inject faults into running instances, not stopped instances. A limitation of AWS fault injection service in relation to EC2 instances is that it can only inject faults into running instances, not stopped instances. What is a key advantage of using AWS fault injection service to test fault tolerance? It eliminates the need for monitoring tools during tests. It ensures zero downtime during fault injection experiments. It provides real-time alerts for every fault injected. It enables controlled and precise fault injection without affecting production. A key advantage of using AWS fault injection service to test fault tolerance is its capability to enable controlled and precise fault injection without affecting production environments. Which AWS resource can be targeted for fault injection using AWS fault injection service? Elastic Load Balancer, AWS Glue, AWS Key Management Service, AWS Elastic Beanstalk. AWS Fault Injection Service can target various AWS resources like EC2 instances, RDS databases, and elastic load balancers for injecting faults. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what does the pause after each fault setting help achieve during fault injection experiments? To allow manual verification of each injected fault impact. To extend the duration of fault injection experiments. To automatically resume fault injection after recovery is detected. To minimize the number of CloudWatch alarms triggered. The pause after each fault setting in AWS Fault Injection Service helps achieve manual verification of each injected fault impact, ensuring thorough analysis and understanding of system behavior. What is a recommended step before starting a fault injection test with AWS Fault Injection Service? Disable all network security rules. Increase the number of active instances. Run a load test on production servers. Back up critical data and configurations. Before starting a fault injection test with AWS Fault Injection Service, it's recommended to back up critical data and configurations to mitigate potential risks. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what is the purpose of the duration setting in fault injection experiments? To specify how long faults are injected into resources. To define the AWS region where faults will be injected. To set the number of fault injection attempts per resource. To schedule the start time of fault injections. The duration setting in AWS Fault Injection Service specifies how long faults are injected into resources during fault injection experiments. What is a key advantage of using AWS Fault Injection Service over traditional testing methods? It allows for precise and controlled fault injection into production-like environments. It provides detailed performance logs without additional tools. It requires no setup or configuration. It automatically fixes issues identified during testing. AWS Fault Injection Service allows precise and controlled fault injection into production-like environments, helping identify and fix issues proactively. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate high traffic conditions? Amazon S3 Glacier, AWS Elastic Load Balancing, AWS IoT Core, AWS Directory Service. AWS Fault Injection Service can integrate with AWS Elastic Load Balancing to simulate high traffic conditions and test load balancing performance. Which type of fault injection is not supported by AWS Fault Injection Service? Database query injection. Network packet delay injection. Disk latency injection. CPU spike injection. AWS Fault Injection Service supports injecting network traffic delays, packet loss, and other faults into AWS resources, but does not inject database queries or simulate disk latency directly. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate service disruptions in a controlled manner? AWS Direct Connect. AWS Code Pipeline. AWS Elastic Load Balancing. Amazon S3. AWS Fault Injection Service integrates with AWS Elastic Load Balancing to simulate service disruptions and test load balancing configurations. What is a key consideration when selecting the fault injection rate setting in AWS Fault Injection Service? To minimize fault injection latency. To inject faults across all resources simultaneously. To ensure tests remain within acceptable performance thresholds. To maximize CloudWatch alarms triggered. When selecting the fault injection rate in AWS Fault Injection Service, it's crucial to ensure tests remain within acceptable performance thresholds to avoid excessive disruption. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what does the recovery window setting determine? The duration after fault injection to observe system recovery. The number of recovery attempts allowed before system failure. The frequency of fault injection tests. The speed at which faults are injected. The recovery window in AWS Fault Injection Service determines the duration after fault injection during which system recovery and behavior are observed. In AWS Fault Injection Service, what does safety checks help ensure during fault injection experiments? That all CloudWatch alarms are disabled during testing. That the fault injection experiments complete within a specified time frame. That injected faults do not cause irreversible damage or data loss. That the AWS region selected is compatible with fault injection. Safety checks in AWS Fault Injection Service help ensure that injected faults do not cause irreversible damage or data loss during fault injection experiments. What is a key benefit of integrating AWS Fault Injection Service with AWS CloudFormation? Automating the setup of fault injection tests. Enhancing data encryption. Enabling real-time application monitoring. Reducing AWS service costs. Integrating AWS Fault Injection Service with AWS CloudFormation allows automating the setup of fault injection tests, making it easier to replicate and control test environments. What is a recommended best practice when using AWS Fault Injection Service for testing? Run fault injections during peak traffic periods. Limit the scope of fault injection to non-production environments initially. Inject faults randomly across all production instances. Disable CloudWatch alarms during fault injection. AWS recommends starting fault injections in non-production environments to understand impact before moving to production, ensuring minimal disruption. In which AWS region is AWS Fault Injection Service available? Europe. Asia Pacific. US East. Multiple AWS regions. Check AWS documentation for current availability. AWS Fault Injection Service is available in multiple AWS regions, but availability can vary. Checking AWS documentation is recommended. Which AWS service can AWS Fault Injection Service integrate with to simulate denial of service attacks? AWS Elastic Load Balancing. AWS CloudTrail, AWS Shield, Amazon Kinesis. AWS Fault Injection Service can integrate with AWS Shield to simulate denial-of-service attacks and test DDoS protection mechanisms. And that's a wrap. Thanks to everyone who participated. Remember, you can answer along on quizalto.com, where you can keep track of your progress and find much more quizzes. We hope you had a fun and challenging time. Until next time. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel for more. Hit the bell icon to be notified as soon as we upload. Please leave a comment if you have any thoughts or suggestions, and, if you think this video is worth sharing with someone who could benefit from it, please forward a link to them. See you next time. Thanks for watching.